The letter didn't look important at first, just another envelope mixed in with bills and advertisements. I almost left it on the counter, but something about my parents' names printed across the top made my chest tighten. They'd been gone for months, and most days I still didn't know what to do with the silence they left behind. The lawyer's words felt cold and distant, a property transferred solely into my name. My siblings barely reacted, like it was something small, something forgettable. But when I drove out to see it myself, I realized this wasn't just an old building. Standing in front of that rusted door, holding a key I didn't remember ever seeing before, I felt like my parents had hidden a whole part of their lives and maybe a part of mine too. I didn't expect to feel anything when the lawyer called. By that point, most conversations about my parents had turned into paperwork, signatures, confirmations, small legal details that made everything feel colder than it should have. Grief had already settled into something quiet and heavy, the kind that follows you around without making noise. So when he said there was one more property left to discuss, I assumed it was a mistake. My parents had never been the type to talk openly about money or assets. Growing up, we lived simply. Nothing fancy, nothing that suggested there were secrets waiting somewhere in the background. My siblings always joked that if there was an inheritance, it would probably be a box of old tools and a stack of unpaid bills. I used to laugh with them, even though a part of me wondered if they saw me as the one who needed the least, the one who would just accept whatever came without asking questions. The lawyer's office smelled faintly like old paper and coffee. I remember sitting there, hands folded in my lap, listening to him explain the details while sunlight slid across the table. He used calm, careful words, but none of them felt real until he pushed a folder toward me and said, "Your parents left this specifically in your name." I opened it slowly, expecting to see something small, maybe a storage unit or a forgotten plot of land. Instead, there was a photo clipped to the paperwork. A faded image of an old industrial building, the kind you'd pass on a highway without ever noticing. Rusted metal siding, broken windows, a heavy door that looked like it hadn't been opened in years.
I stared at it longer than I meant to.
My brother leaned back in his chair, barely glancing at the picture. "That old place," he said. "I thought they sold that years ago." My sister shrugged, already scrolling through her phone. Probably worthless anyway. Their reactions felt too quick, too dismissive, like they'd already decided the building didn't matter. I nodded along, pretending I agreed, but something about the way the lawyer kept watching me made it clear there was more to this than they were saying out loud. "Your parents held onto it intentionally," he added gently. "They made sure it stayed separate from the rest of the estate."
Separate.
The word stuck with me all afternoon. On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I tried to remember if my parents had ever mentioned an old warehouse or building, but nothing clear came to mind. There were vague childhood memories of long car rides and waiting in the back seat while my father disappeared into places that smelled like oil and dust. At the time, I never asked questions. Kids rarely do when they trust everything is under control. That evening, my phone buzzed with messages from my siblings. Practical questions: what I planned to do with the property, whether I'd try to sell it, if there were any hidden debts attached. None of them sounded curious. None of them sounded emotional. It was as if the building already belonged to the category of things that didn't matter. I typed a few short replies and then put my phone face down on the table. The truth was, I didn't know what I felt. Part of me wondered if my parents had given me the building because it was the least valuable thing they owned. That thought stung more than I wanted to admit. Growing up, I'd always tried to be the dependable one, the person who didn't ask for much, who stepped back so everyone else could have what they needed. It wasn't resentment exactly, just a quiet pattern that followed me into adulthood. Now I was holding a key, literally and emotionally, to something none of us seemed to understand. Later that night, I spread the documents across my kitchen counter. The address looked familiar in a distant way, like a word you recognize but can't place in a sentence. There were old maintenance receipts tucked into the folder, dated years apart. My father's signature appeared again and again, neat and steady, but nothing Proof that he had visited the building long after I thought he'd left that part of his life behind. Why hadn't he told me? I tried to imagine a conversation where he would have explained it, sitting at the kitchen table, maybe over coffee, telling me about a place that mattered to him. But that conversation never happened. We talked about everyday things, about work, about weather, about small family updates. The deeper parts of his life stayed tucked away behind quiet smiles and unfinished sentences. As the nights stretched on, memories began to shift in small, unexpected ways. I remembered my mother coming home late sometimes, her clothes carrying a faint smell of metal or paint. I remembered overhearing arguments about holding on to the past, words I didn't understand at the time. Back then, I thought they were talking about ordinary worries. Now, those moments felt like pieces of a puzzle I had never realized existed. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The folder was still on the counter, sunlight touching the edges of the papers. I poured myself coffee and stared at the photo again, the old building standing alone against a pale sky. It didn't look welcoming. It didn't look valuable. But it felt important in a way I couldn't explain. My sister called just after 9. "So, what are you going to do with it?" she asked. "I'm not sure yet," I said honestly. "Well, don't let it become a burden," she replied. Sometimes parents hold on to things for sentimental reasons that don't make sense anymore. Her words lingered after the call ended. A burden. Maybe she was right. Maybe the building was just another piece of unfinished business my parents had left behind. But something inside me resisted that idea. I folded the documents carefully, slipped the key into my pocket, and stood by the window for a long moment. The sky outside was clear, the kind of quiet morning that makes decisions feel heavier than they are. I realized that if I didn't go see the place for myself, it would always remain a question, an unfinished story. For years, I had accepted the version of my family that existed on the surface, practical, reserved, unwilling to talk about deeper emotions. Maybe I had even contributed to that silence by never pushing for more. Now I had a chance to step into something they had chosen specifically for me, even if I didn't understand why. I grabbed my keys from the table and headed toward the door. As I stepped outside, the air felt colder than usual, sharp against my skin. I locked the house behind me and paused for a second, feeling the weight of the small metal key in my pocket. It wasn't just a piece of property anymore. It felt like an invitation, or maybe a challenge, left behind by two people who had never fully explained themselves. I didn't know what I would find when I got there. But for the first time since the lawyer's call, I felt something stronger than confusion. I felt curiosity, and a quiet pull toward a place my parents had kept hidden, waiting for me to decide whether it was truly nothing, or something they had trusted only me to understand. The drive out to the address felt longer than it should have. Maybe it was because I kept second-guessing myself, checking the GPS every few minutes like it might suddenly tell me to turn around and go home. The highway slowly gave way to quieter roads, then to an industrial stretch of town I barely recognized. Buildings grew older, paint faded, windows covered in dust. It wasn't the kind of place you visited unless you had a reason. I wasn't sure what my reason was yet. The closer I got, the more memories started pressing against the edges of my mind, small, blurry flashes that didn't fully make sense. Sitting in the back seat of my father's truck, the hum of tires on pavement, the smell of coffee mixed with metal. I couldn't tell if those memories were real or if my brain was just trying to fill in gaps now that I had an address and a story to attach them to. When the GPS finally announced I had arrived, I almost drove past it. The building sat slightly back from the road, half hidden behind an old chain-link fence. Weeds pushed up through cracks in the pavement, and a faded sign hung crookedly near the gate, its letters worn away by years of sun and rain. For a moment, I wondered if I had the wrong place. It didn't look like something anyone would hold on to intentionally. I parked across the street and stayed in the car longer than I planned. From a distance, the warehouse looked smaller than it did in the photo, but heavier somehow, like it carried years inside its walls. The metal siding had dulled into a grayish-brown, and one corner of the roof dipped slightly, as if it had grown tired of holding itself up. A gust of wind pushed loose gravel across the ground, the sound sharp in the otherwise quiet afternoon. My first instinct was to leave. Not out of fear exactly, but because standing there made everything feel more real than I was ready for. The inheritance wasn't just paperwork anymore. It was a physical place, something my parents had chosen to keep, something they had handed to me without explanation. I reached into my pocket and felt the edge of the key. It was heavier than it looked, old-fashioned, the metal slightly worn from years of use. I turned it between my fingers, imagining my father doing the same thing at some point, standing right where I was now. The thought made my chest tighten unexpectedly. After a few deep breaths, I stepped out of the car. The air smelled faintly like rust and dust. Each step toward the gate felt slower than the last, as if my body was trying to delay whatever came next. I pushed the gate open, the hinges groaning loudly, and walked up the cracked pavement toward the building's main door. Up close, the details felt sharper. Layers of old paint peeled from the metal walls. A small window near the entrance had been covered from the inside, blocking any view beyond it. The heavy door stood in front of me, the same one from the photograph, its surface scratched and faded, a simple lock hanging in the center. I hesitated before touching it, my mind filled with questions that had no answers yet. Why me? Why had my parents never talked about this place? And why did it feel less like an abandoned building and more like a memory waiting to be opened? I ran my hand lightly over the door. The metal felt cool beneath my fingers. For a second, I closed my eyes, letting the quiet settle around me. There were no voices here, no siblings offering opinions, no lawyer explaining legal terms. Just me and a space my parents had left behind. A car passed slowly on the road behind me, then disappeared. I thought about calling my sister, maybe asking if she remembered anything about this place that I didn't. But something told me this moment needed to stay private, at least for now. Whatever I found here, I wanted to see it through my own eyes before anyone else's interpretation changed how it felt. I slipped the key into the lock, but didn't turn it yet. Instead, I stepped back and looked at the building again, really looked at it this time. The way the sunlight hit one side, while leaving the other in shadow. The quiet strength in its structure despite years of neglect. It reminded me of my parents in a strange way, steady, reserved, carrying stories they rarely shared out loud. A memory surfaced unexpectedly, my mother sitting at the kitchen table late at night, going through a stack of papers while my father leaned against the counter, arms crossed. They weren't arguing exactly, but the air between them felt heavy. I remembered asking what they were doing, and my mother smiling gently, saying, "Just taking care of old things." At the time, I assumed she meant bills. Now I wasn't so sure. The wind picked up again, rattling something loose against the side of the building. I jumped slightly, then laughed under my breath at my own nerves. It wasn't fear that held me back, it was the weight of expectation. Once I opened that door, whatever story my parents had left here would stop being a mystery. And part of me wasn't ready to lose the mystery yet. I walked slowly around the outside of the building, noticing details I had missed at first glance. A faded line on the ground where a sign might have stood years ago. A small side entrance sealed shut with bolts. Old tire marks near the back, barely visible beneath layers of dust. Each detail made the place feel less abandoned and more paused, like it had been waiting rather than forgotten. When I returned to the front door, my hesitation felt softer, replaced by something closer to determination. I thought about the way my siblings had dismissed the property so quickly. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was just an old warehouse with nothing meaningful left inside. But standing there, holding the key my parents had chosen to give me, I felt a quiet sense of responsibility I couldn't explain. This wasn't about money or value. It was about understanding a part of their lives they had never put into words. I rested my forehead lightly against the cool metal of the door and took one steady breath. The world felt unusually still, as if even the noise of the road had faded for a moment. "All right," I whispered softly, more to myself than anyone else. My hand tightened around the key. I slid it fully into the lock and paused again, feeling the weight of the moment settle into my chest. The sunlight shifted slightly behind me, casting my shadow across the door like a quiet reminder that I wasn't the same person who had walked into the lawyer's office days earlier. Back then, the building had been just an idea, something distant and abstract. Now it stood right in front of me, waiting. I closed my eyes for a second, letting curiosity replace the last traces of doubt. Then, I turned the key. The lock gave way, with a heavy click that echoed louder than I expected. For a moment, I just stood there, my hand still on the key, listening to the sound fade into the quiet around me. The door didn't move right away. It felt stuck, like it had been holding its breath for years. I pulled gently at first, then a little harder. The hinges groaned, metal scraping against metal, and a thin line of darkness opened in front of me. Cool air drifted out, carrying the faint smell of dust, oil, and something older, something familiar in a way I couldn't quite place. I hesitated on the threshold. The sunlight from outside stretched across the concrete floor, cutting through the dimness inside. Dust floated in the air like tiny sparks, moving slowly in the beam of light. It felt less like entering a building and more like stepping into a memory someone had paused long ago. I took one careful step inside. The temperature dropped immediately, the quiet wrapping around me in a way that made every small sound feel louder. My footsteps echoed softly as I moved forward, eyes adjusting to the shadows. Rows of old shelves lined one wall, some empty, others holding boxes and tools covered in a thin layer of gray. Nothing looked valuable, and yet nothing felt random either. I closed the door behind me halfway, letting just enough light in to keep the space from feeling completely closed off. The air smelled exactly the way I remembered from somewhere deep in childhood, a mix of metal and sawdust, the kind of scent that stays in your clothes long after you leave. I stood there for a second, letting the memories come on their own instead of forcing them. A workbench sat near the center of the room, sturdy despite its age. Scratches and stains marked the surface, signs of years of use. I ran my fingers along the edge and felt a strange wave of emotion I wasn't prepared for. It was such an ordinary object, but it carried a quiet sense of presence, as if someone had only stepped away for a moment. "Okay," I whispered to myself, my voice sounding smaller than usual in the open space. I moved slowly, taking in details piece by piece. A stack of old wooden crates near the back wall. A faded calendar, hanging crookedly, its pages turned to a year that made my chest tighten. My father's handwriting appeared in small notes scribbled across one corner, dates, measurements, reminders written in the same careful style I'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists. He had been here more often than I ever realized. The thought settled heavily in my chest. I picked up a small object from the workbench, an old measuring tape, worn smooth from use. For a second, I could almost hear his voice explaining how to hold it steady, how to double-check numbers before making a cut. I didn't know if that memory was real or something my mind was creating now that I stood in this place, but it felt close enough to touch. The deeper I walked into the building, the more it felt alive with quiet history. Not grand or dramatic, just steady, patient evidence that this space had mattered to someone. A row of metal cabinets lined one side, their handles slightly rusted. I opened one carefully and found neatly stacked folders inside, edges yellowed but organized with surprising care. Nothing chaotic. Nothing careless. That detail struck me harder than anything else. My parents weren't people who held on to things without purpose. If they kept this building, if they continued coming here for years without telling us, there had to be a reason that went beyond simple sentiment. A faint creak echoed from somewhere deeper in the warehouse as the structure shifted with the wind outside. I froze for a second, then laughed quietly at myself. The sound felt less like a warning and more like the building acknowledging my presence, as if it had been waiting for someone to walk through its doors again. I moved toward the back wall, where a narrow hallway led to a smaller section of the space. The light faded there, shadows stretching longer across the floor. My heartbeat picked up slightly, not out of fear, but anticipation. That's when I noticed something different. One door at the end of the hallway stood closed, its surface cleaner than everything else around it. The handle looked newer, the lock less worn. It didn't match the rest of the building's age, and for a moment I just stared at it, a quiet tension building in my chest.
I didn't open it yet.
Instead, I leaned against the wall and took a slow breath, letting the weight of the moment settle. Walking into the warehouse hadn't felt like discovering something new. It felt like uncovering a part of my parents' lives that had been hidden in plain sight all along. The resentment I carried when I first arrived began to soften, replaced by something more complicated.
Curiosity.
Sadness. Maybe even a quiet respect for the way they had preserved this place, even when no one else understood why. I looked back toward the main room, the sunlight still spilling across the floor near the entrance. From this angle, the building didn't look abandoned anymore. It looked paused, like a story waiting for someone to listen closely enough to hear it. My eyes returned to the closed door at the end of the hallway. Whatever was behind it felt important. And for the first time since stepping inside, I realized this wasn't just about understanding my parents. It was about understanding myself, the version of me they had trusted with a key, the version that now stood in the quiet space between what I thought I knew and what was slowly beginning to reveal itself. I didn't open the door at the end of a hallway right away. Instead, I found myself drifting back toward the main room, drawn to the smaller details I had rushed past when I first walked in. It felt strange how quickly the building was changing in my mind, less like an abandoned place and more like a quiet record of moments I had never been invited to see before. Near one of the shelves, I noticed an old folding chair tucked beside a small table. A coffee mug sat there, chipped along the rim, a faint ring marking where it had rested for years. My father always drank his coffee black, no sugar, no cream. Seeing that mug made something tighten in my chest, a realization that he had probably sat here alone many mornings while the rest of us went on with our lives without ever asking where he disappeared to. I ran my hand across the table's surface and closed my eyes for a second. Memories started to shift, not loud or dramatic, just quiet adjustments to things I thought I understood. I remember the nights he came home later than usual, the way my mother would look at him with a mixture of worry and patience. Back then, I assumed they were dealing with ordinary stress. Now I wondered if this place had always been part of their private world. There was a photo pinned to a corkboard nearby, edges curled with age. It showed my parents standing together, younger than I ever remember them being, both smiling in a way that felt relaxed and unguarded. Behind them, I recognized the outline of this very building, but it looked newer than stronger, like something they were proud of rather than something hidden. Why had they stopped talking about it? That question settled quietly into my thoughts as I walked slowly across the room. I realized that most of my life I had only seen the version of my parents they chose to show us, responsible, practical, always focused on keeping things steady. Maybe this place held the parts of them they never found the right words to explain. The resentment I carried when I first arrived felt smaller now, softened by a growing sense of curiosity. Instead of feeling like I had been given something unwanted, I started to feel like I had been trusted with a story that wasn't finished yet. My eyes drifted back toward the hallway, toward the closed door waiting at the end. Whatever came next, I knew I wasn't just walking through an old building anymore. I was walking deeper into a past that was slowly changing the way I remembered everything. The door at the end of the hallway felt different the closer I got to it. Unlike everything else in the building, it looked cared for, the paint less faded, the handle polished from use. I stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet around me, almost expecting to hear footsteps or voices on the other side. Of course, there was nothing but the soft hum of the building settling into itself. My hand hovered over the handle before finally turning it. The room inside was smaller than I imagined, more like an office than a storage space. Sunlight filtered through a narrow window, illuminating a desk pushed neatly against the wall. Papers were stacked in careful piles, and a single lamp sat in the corner, as if someone had just switched it off before leaving. The air felt heavier here, not dusty or abandoned, but personal. I stepped closer to the desk, my eyes landing on a worn leather notebook resting at the center. It wasn't hidden or locked away. It was placed there intentionally, waiting. I opened it slowly, half expecting to find random notes or old receipts. Instead, I recognized my father's handwriting immediately, steady, deliberate, the same letters I had seen on birthday cards my whole life. The pages weren't about business or money. They were filled with plans, sketches of ideas, reminders written to himself, small reflections about time and choices. One line caught my attention more than anything else. Some things are better understood later. I closed the notebook gently, my chest tightening in a way that surprised me. This wasn't just a forgotten workspace. It felt like a place my parents had protected, not from us, but maybe for me. Standing there, I realized the building wasn't revealing its secrets all at once. It was asking me to slow down, to see each piece the way they had left it, careful, quiet, and deeply intentional. I sat down in the chair behind the desk without really thinking about it. The leather creaked softly under my weight, a sound that felt strangely familiar, like I had heard it somewhere before. The notebook rested in my hands, heavier now that I understood it wasn't just a collection of notes. It was a glimpse into a part of my parents' lives they had never explained out loud. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the quiet. It was my brother. For a second, I considered ignoring it, but something told me avoiding the outside world wouldn't make it disappear. I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "So, did you go see the place yet?" he asked, his tone casual, almost distracted. "I'm here now," I said, glancing around the room as if he could somehow see it through the phone. There was a brief pause. "Honestly, I don't know why they kept it," he replied. "Mom used to say it was more trouble than it was worth." His words hit harder than I expected. Sitting in that quiet office, surrounded by careful stacks of papers and my father's handwriting, the idea that this place meant nothing felt impossible. I didn't argue with him. I just listened, realizing how differently we all remembered the same people. "Are you planning to sell it?" he asked. I looked down at the notebook again, at the line that still echoed in my mind. Some things are better understood later. The building didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt unfinished, like a conversation paused mid-sentence. "I don't know yet," I answered honestly. After we hung up, the silence returned, thicker than before. I leaned back in the chair, letting the weight of the conversation settle. For years, I had accepted my siblings' versions of our parents, practical, cautious, unwilling to hold on to things without reason. But here, inside this hidden office, I was starting to see another side of them. One that wasn't loud or dramatic, just deeply personal. A quiet ache moved through me, not exactly sadness, not exactly anger. Maybe it was the realization that I had spent so much of my life feeling overlooked, assuming I wasn't trusted with the deeper parts of their world. And yet, I was the one sitting here now. I closed the notebook gently and placed it back on the desk, my thoughts shifting. The building wasn't just about memories or property anymore. It was becoming a space where old assumptions met new understanding, where the distance between me and my family felt both sharper and strangely softer at the same time. For the first time since arriving, I wasn't just searching for answers. I was starting to feel the weight of a story that had always been there, waiting for me to finally listen. I stayed in the office longer than I expected, flipping slowly through the notebook as if the pages might change if I rushed them. The handwriting felt steady, calm, not the kind of words someone writes in a hurry. Most of it wasn't dramatic. Just small reflections, reminders, pieces of thought that sounded more like quiet conversations with himself than anything meant for anyone else. One page stopped me. It wasn't a long entry, just a few lines written more carefully than the rest. Not everything we protect looks valuable from the outside. Some things need time and the right person. My chest tightened as I read it again, the words landing heavier each time. I didn't know if he meant the building or something deeper, maybe both. I leaned back in the chair, letting the silence settle around me. For years, I had assumed my parents kept parts of their lives hidden because they didn't trust us, or maybe because they didn't think we cared enough to understand. But sitting here now, I started to wonder if they had simply been waiting for the right moment, a moment that only made sense after everything else had changed. A small envelope slipped from between the pages when I turned another sheet. My name was written on the front in my mother's handwriting, softer and more curved than my father's. Seeing it made my throat tighten instantly. I held it carefully, almost afraid to open it. The room felt smaller somehow, the air heavier with emotion. Outside, the building creaked quietly as the wind moved against its walls, but inside the office everything felt still, like time had paused again, waiting for me to decide what to do next. I didn't rush. Instead, I ran my thumb along the edge of the envelope, remembering the way my mother used to leave small notes in unexpected places, inside books, tucked into kitchen drawers, slipped into my bag when I wasn't looking. Those little gestures always felt simple at the time. Now they felt intentional, like she had always been speaking in a language I was only beginning to understand. When I finally opened it, the paper inside was folded neatly. The message wasn't long, but it felt personal in a way that made my eyes sting. A few quiet sentences about patience, about seeing things fully before judging them. No dramatic confessions, no grand explanations, just a gentle reminder that some parts of life only reveal their meaning when you're ready to see them differently. I lowered the letter slowly, the weight of it settling deep inside me. For the first time since stepping into the warehouse, I felt the shift clearly, the resentment that had followed me here beginning to dissolve into something softer. Not answers yet, not closure, but understanding starting to take shape, one quiet discovery at a time. I didn't realize how much time had passed until the light coming through the small office window began to change. The harsh brightness of the afternoon softened into a warmer glow, stretching long shadows across the floor. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the notebook, my hands moving slower than before, like I didn't want to disturb the quiet feeling that had settled around me. For the first time since arriving, I wasn't focused on what the building used to be. My thoughts shifted toward what it could become. I stepped back into the main room and looked at the space differently. The dust and where it didn't feel like signs of neglect anymore, they felt like layers waiting to be brushed away. I ran my hand along one of the shelves, leaving a clean line through the gray surface. It was a small gesture, almost automatic, but it changed something inside me. Instead of standing there as someone who had inherited a burden, I felt like someone being invited to continue a story. Near the entrance, I found an old broom leaning against the wall. Without thinking too much about it, I picked it up and began sweeping a small patch of the floor. The sound of the bristles moving across concrete echoed softly, steady and calming. It wasn't about cleaning the whole place, just about doing something tangible, something that connected me to the space in a new way. As I worked, memories surfaced again, but they felt lighter this time. I remembered my father teaching me how to fix small things around the house, always patient, always encouraging me to try even when I doubted myself. I remembered my mother saying that spaces carry energy, that they change depending on the people who care for them. Back then, I thought she was just being sentimental. Now, standing in the middle of the warehouse, I started to understand what she meant. The building didn't need to become something grand or impressive. It just needed presence, someone willing to see beyond the surface and give it meaning again. And for the first time, I considered that maybe my parents hadn't left me this place because it was easy, but because they believed I would see what others didn't. I set the broom down and looked around slowly, imagining light filling the space, shelves organized, doors open instead of closed. The thought didn't feel overwhelming anymore. It felt possible, not as a responsibility forced on me, but as a choice I could make on my own terms, a quiet beginning rather than an ending. I stepped outside for a few minutes, needing fresh air more than I expected. The sun hung lower now, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. From a distance, the warehouse looked exactly the same, worn, quiet, almost invisible. But standing there after everything I had seen inside, it felt different. It felt heavier with meaning. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my sister. I hesitated before answering, knowing the conversation might pull me back into the version of the story I used to believe. "So, is it as bad as it looks?" she asked without much greeting. I glanced back at the building, the rusted door still slightly open behind me. "No," I said slowly. "It's not bad, just unfinished." She sighed. "I don't know why they kept that place. Mom always said it was tied to old mistakes." Her words hit a nerve I didn't expect. Old mistakes. Maybe that was true. Maybe the building carried regrets my parents never fully shared. But after reading the notebook and the letter, I couldn't see it as something negative anymore. I think it meant more to them than we realized, I replied quietly. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind that fills with unspoken history. Growing up, my siblings and I had learned to avoid deeper conversations about our parents' past. We focused on what was practical, what was visible. Now I was standing in a space that challenged all of that. Well, she said finally, just don't let it pull you back into things that don't matter anymore. After we hung up, I sat down on the low concrete step outside the door. Her words lingered, but they didn't shake me the way they might have before. Instead, they made me realize how differently we were processing the same inheritance. To them, the building was a leftover piece of the past. To me, it was starting to feel like a bridge, something that connected the parts of our family we never fully talked about. I rested my elbows on my knees and looked out toward the quiet road. For years, I had carried small resentments without even noticing them, assumptions that I had been given less, trusted less, seen less clearly. But now, sitting here with dust on my hands and my parents' words echoing in my mind, I felt those old feelings begin to shift. Maybe the confrontation wasn't with my siblings at all. Maybe it was with the version of myself who had believed I was always standing outside the deeper parts of my family's story, when in reality, I had been handed the key all along. I went back inside as the light began to fade, the air cooler now, quieter in a way that felt almost reflective. The warehouse didn't feel intimidating anymore. It felt patient, like it had been waiting for me to see everything in the right order. The office door stood open, and the notebook rested exactly where I had left it. For a moment, I just stood there, letting the silence settle around me again. Something inside me felt unfinished, a sense that there was still one more piece my parents had left behind, something I hadn't fully understood yet. As I picked up the notebook, a small metal box tucked beneath the desk caught my eye. It blended into the shadows, so while I almost missed it earlier, the lid wasn't locked, just resting gently on top, as if whoever placed it there never meant to hide it completely. I lifted it slowly. Inside were a few carefully folded documents and a small cassette recorder, older than anything I had seen in years. My fingers hesitated over it, a strange mix of anticipation and nervousness rising in my chest. I pressed the play button, half expecting nothing to happen. A soft click echoed through the room, followed by the faint hum of recorded sound. My father's voice filled the quiet space, calm and steady, older but unmistakable. He wasn't explaining business plans or giving instructions. He was talking about time, about how some choices look like mistakes until years later, when their meaning finally becomes clear. He spoke slowly, as if he knew whoever listened would need space to understand. I sat down, the recorder resting in my hands, my throat tightening with every word. There was no dramatic confession, no sudden revelation. Just honesty, the kind that arrives gently but settles deeply. He talked about wanting to leave something behind that wasn't measured by money, something that would only matter to someone willing to look beyond the surface. When the recording ended, the room felt different. Not louder or heavier, just clearer. I closed the metal box and sat quietly for a moment, letting everything settle into place. The building no longer felt like a mystery waiting to be solved. It felt like a conversation my parents had started long ago, trusting that one day I would be ready to listen fully. And for the first time since walking through that rusted door, I realized the inheritance wasn't just about what they left me. It was about what they believed I would eventually become. I stayed in the office long after the recording ended, the quiet hum of the building filling the space where my father's voice had been. For years, I had measured decisions by what felt safe, what made sense to everyone else. Sitting there now, I realized this place wasn't asking me to repeat the past. It was asking me to choose what came next. I walked back into the main room slowly, noticing how different it felt compared to when I first arrived. The shadows seemed softer, the air less heavy. Maybe nothing had physically changed, but something inside me had shifted. The warehouse no longer looked like an old burden waiting to be sold. It looked like possibility, not grand or perfect, just honest. I stood near the workbench and rested my hands on its worn surface. My father had spent hours here, quietly building or fixing things without needing recognition. My mother had believed in preserving spaces that carried meaning beyond what others could see. For the first time, I understood that they hadn't left me instructions because they trusted me to find my own direction. The idea of selling the building crossed my mind briefly. It would have been the easiest choice, the most practical. But it didn't feel right anymore. Not after everything I had read and heard. This place had been part of their story, but it was also becoming part of mine. I picked up the old broom again and swept a wider section of the floor, the steady rhythm grounding me. Each movement felt symbolic, like clearing space not just in the room, but inside myself. I wasn't trying to restore the building overnight. I was simply acknowledging that it deserved presence, and so did I. Outside, the light continued to fade, turning the windows into soft reflections. I imagined opening the doors fully one day, letting fresh air move through the space, maybe turning it into something that served others the way my parents had quietly served their own purpose here. For so long, I had believed independence meant walking away from the past. Now I realized it could also mean choosing which parts of it to carry forward, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. I set the broom down and looked around one last time before heading toward the door. The building felt less like an inheritance and more like a turning point, a quiet decision to stop waiting for permission and start shaping something meaningful on my own terms. By the time I stepped outside, the sky had shifted into that soft blue-gray color that only comes right before evening settles in. The air felt cooler, calmer, like the world itself had slowed down. I turned to face the warehouse one more time, noticing how different it looked now compared to when I first arrived. The rusted metal and cracked pavement were still there, but they didn't feel heavy anymore. They felt honest. I locked the door gently, sliding the key back into my pocket with a sense of quiet certainty. Earlier that day, I had stood in this exact spot wondering why my parents would leave me something that looked like nothing. Now, I understood that they hadn't left me an answer. They had left me a chance to see beyond what everyone else dismissed. As I walked toward my car, memories followed me, but they didn't carry the same weight they once did. I thought about all the times I assumed I was the overlooked one in the family, the one expected to accept whatever came without question. Maybe there had been truth in that feeling. But standing inside the warehouse, reading their words and hearing my father's voice, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. Being trusted quietly is still being trusted deeply. I sat behind the wheel for a moment without starting the engine. The steering wheel felt warm under my hands, grounding me in the present. For years, I believed closure came from dramatic moments, big conversations, clear apologies, or sudden understanding. But today had been different. Nothing loud had happened. No one had argued or confessed. The change had been slow, almost invisible, like dust settling after a long silence. And somehow that felt more real. I glanced back at the building through the rearview mirror. It didn't look abandoned anymore. It looked patient, like a place that had been waiting for someone to listen without rushing to judge. My parents had carried pieces of their lives quietly, protecting them until the right time. Maybe they knew I wouldn't understand when I was younger. Maybe they knew I needed to walk my own path first before stepping into theirs. The resentment I brought with me that morning had softened into something gentler. Not perfect understanding, not complete peace, just a sense that I had been given a perspective I didn't have before. The warehouse had become more than a property. It was a reminder that love doesn't always look obvious, and that sometimes the most meaningful gifts are the ones that ask you to slow down and look closer. I started the car and pulled slowly onto the quiet road, watching the building fade into the distance. I didn't know exactly what it would become yet, whether it would stay a private space, grow into something new, or simply exist as a place I returned to when I needed to remember who I was becoming. But for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was carrying the past alone. I felt like I was walking forward with it, not as a burden, but as a story still unfolding, one quiet decision at a time. If this story felt real to you, share your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. And if you enjoy slow, human stories about family, choices, and second chances, subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter.